cure both senility and seniority, both terrible legislative diseases. Harry S. Truman. According to Stephen C. Erickson, in a bulwark against faction, James Madison approved and wanted to implement term limits for elected officials. Career politicians are going nowhere unless action is taken. My goal is to persuade you to remove career politicians from office. I'll talk about Congress wrongdoings, public supports, why it hasn't been passed, and what I'd recommend to get them out of office. Congress isn't what people think it is. Congress is filled with a bunch of people that did good at one point, but they need to retire. I have 4 reasons for this. They waste taxes, they care more about re-election, succumbing to lobbying, and they're old. The US keeps spending more money than it has. People who want to implement term limits wants to decrease special interest legislation. Consider a classic example. A bridge is being built in one district in order to benefit individuals living in that district, but is funded by taxes collected from all districts. This quote comes from Keith Larson's book, Republican Revolutionaries and Tea Patriots, a public choice analysis of congressional term limits. More examples are Bridge to Nowhere in Alaska. Alright, so that's a bridge. An Alaskan senator brought $200 million to Alaska, and he decided to build a bridge connecting to a small island that only has 50 people on there. He did this just to get votes. Another example is Train to Nowhere. This is a train rail being built in California. It was estimated to cost $5 billion back in 2008, and now prices have quintupled, and now it's at $25 billion. And after 14 years, they're still not done, and it's estimated to be done in 2030. Incumbency, the holding of an office or the periods of one's held, Oxford Dictionary. This term is important because Congress has become to this point. Frenzel, author of Term Limits in the Immortal Congress, states, in 1990, only 1 in 20 races for the U.S. House could be described as competitive. That year, only 4 out of 5 incumbents got 60% of their votes in that district. This shows that Congress has no competition due to their power. Lobbying. This is when a group of people come together to convince a congressman to vote a certain way on a bill. In return, they get funds for their campaign. This goes against what a congressman should stand for. A voter's vote should come before money. As long as members have the chance to spend their lives in Washington, their interests will always be skewed towards spending the taxpayer dollars to buy off special interests, covering corruption, bureaucracy, fundraising relations, building among lobbyists, and trading in favors. This shows that your votes come in second to money. There we got a little lobbying cartoon. Alright, and lastly, they're old. So 31 out of 100 current senators are 70 and older. This is Dianne Feinstein. She was in Congress last fall. She died of her age. She had multiple strokes and had to be pushed around, and she was 90 when she died. So there was a 90-year-old running in Congress. So I don't think that's the most representational of the current population. I asked in my audience analysis, do you have any thoughts about Congress? One answer really stuck out. I think that a lot of the things they do are rather unproductive, mostly just to make sure they're reelected. I decided to do some more research, and I found that public support is astonishing. The following quote comes from an academic organization, Society. Very strong support for term limits runs through all demographic and political groups. Republicans, 80%, and independents, 81%, are more supported than Democrats, 70%. Even, like I said before, even James Madison supported term limits. Although some, for a reason why it hasn't passed, people, were concerned about women and minorities in Congress. That's if the term limits are imposed, then their representation will be cut in half. Although, however, this is the opposite. At least respect to women, in that the proportion of women elected is likely to increase. In addition, the number of minority legislators is not likely to be seriously affected in the short run. This comes from Joel A. Thompson's research article, The Implication of Term Limits for Women and Minorities. Some evidence from the states. Alright, now, so that's Tom Foley. He was the Speaker of the House back in 1990, and he was from Washington. So he said that term limits, Foley warned voters that term limits would deprive Washington of power, and this comes from explaining public support for legislative term limits. Because Washington is such a water-rich state, he thought that if term limits were imposed, Washington would lose all its power, and that California would gain their water resources. Another reason is Ray Thornton. He's right there. So Arkansas imposed the heaviest term limits on their own state, and Thornton didn't like that, as he was a House of Representative. So he decided to take Arkansas to court, and the Supreme Court found that 5-4 that term limits were indeed illegal, and that they were unconstitutional, and that the only way that we could pass them is to make an amendment. This leads me to the Republican Revolution. This was back in the 1980s, where Republicans promised low taxes, term limits, and a budget bill, and most of the House ended up becoming Republicans, and this was the closest we've ever gotten to passing term limits. They were only 60 votes short, although some Republicans voted against term limits because they would remove them from power. So possible solutions to implement term limits. So we could have another Republican revolution, which is most likely the most unfavorable solution, because we have so many demographics and so many political beliefs that this would just cause a split between society. But one that I really like is a state convention. So here's a map of the states that are in favor of state convention. This is, as Hayes said, that having congressmen vote for term limits on themselves is like telling a vegan to eat meat. It's just not going to happen. And these states support to have a state convention, and as soon as 36 states approve, then there'll be a state convention where they'll impose term limits, and they'll produce a budget defect so they can't spend over what they made. In my Persuasive speech, I told you about why there should be term limits on Congress, public opinion on term limits, why term limits haven't passed, and solutions to impose term limits. This allows for a better understanding of why term limits are important. At the end of the day, the founders meant for the power to belong in the hands of the people. Thank you.